Some questions about the movement for reconstitution. Interview with Línea Proletaria. We publish below an interview proposed by the blog El Bloque del Este. The original idea consisted of its publication in 2017. However, both the priority of other tasks and our commitment to ensure that this work did not simply result in the repetition of positions that can be found in more detail in our publications, but rather that it would result in that fundamental task, which we take very seriously, of training cadres and propagandists, has unfortunately delayed its publication until today. We publicly apologize to the interviewer and hope that the Vanguard can find use in the pages that follow. 1. What is Línea Proletaria? Communism is in a deep crisis, something that no honest communist can question. Accepting that is the first step to be able to consider which tasks concern communists today. The revolutionary cycle that was opened with the Soviet October exhausted its historical premises, which forces us to reposition ourselves as communists that rise to the occasion. If the Vanguard does not assume the consequences of our history, there will be no possible proletarian revolution in the future. That is why the line of reconstitution proposes the ideological reconstitution of communism as the unavoidable current task of the Vanguard, that is, the repositioning of Marxism as the hegemonic theory among the Vanguard, with the summation of the October cycle as the fundamental means for it. Thus, Línea Proletaria is the organ of expression for those of us who work to articulate a revolutionary movement, which expresses the revolutionary ideology of the proletariat as an independent class. Those who refer to communism and its revolutionary history have to seriously consider whether their objective is to work for the revolution or is, on the contrary, to get one or another crumb from the bourgeoisie, reinforcing the general situation of hopelessness in which the world proletariat finds itself in relation to the possibility of a different world. Those who are clear that the solely revolutionary comes first will see in Línea Proletaria a loudspeaker from which to know about and work for the reconstitution of communism. 2. What is the objective of Línea Proletaria? Línea Proletaria expresses the application of Marxism to Marxism itself, being the means for the socialization of the results of the summation of the October cycle in the Vanguard as a whole, as well as other contents and actions typical of the current phase of ideological reconstitution. A socialization that intrinsically supposes the exercise of the two-line struggle and the creation of political ties. Since Línea Proletaria is grouping the most advanced sectors around this construction of the referent of the Marxist-Leninist Vanguard, political correlate of the ideological reconstitution of communism as the Vanguard theory. Inspired, moreover, by the spirit of what Lenin's called to generate an all-Russian newspaper meant for Bolshevism, which would serve to imprint a revolutionary objective and direction common to the entire Russian Marxist vanguard, which would help it overcome the artisanal methods of local circles. And unlike the periodical publications of revisionism, halfway between union bulletins and trend magazines, Línea Proletaria wants to be an expression and means of hooking the vanguard to the substantive tasks that today concern it. Although communism is in crisis, we must keep in mind that we have a historical legacy that our revolutionary predecessors lacked, a vast experience of revolutions, dictatorship of the proletariat and construction of socialism. 3. What is the reconstitution of communism? The reconstitution of communism is nothing other than making communism that real movement which abolishes the present state of things again, that is, the condition of possibility for the revolutionary transformation of humanity in the present historical moment. Reconstitution is necessary for the simple reason that the October cycle was ideologically and politically exhausted along with the historical premises that sustained it. That is why, in order for the proletariat to return to the offensive, initiating a new and superior revolutionary cycle, communism must be ideologically and politically reconstituted on the basis of its accumulated revolutionary experience, as well as on the state of the sciences in general to catch up with the knowledge achieved by humanity in the current historical moment. Without assuming this task, communism, hegemonized today by the rotten fruit of all that historical exhaustion that is the fossilized and absolutely incapable revisionism of our days, will continue in the frank retreat and decomposition in which it has been immersed for too many decades. The double meaning, ideological and political, in which we say that reconstitution is necessary only expresses the need to, first, address the issues that today concern communism as a worldview, as the integral conception of the world that it is against the analytical and fragmentary degradation under which revisionism subjugates it. This ideological task is inseparable from its practical dimension, which is the development of political organizational links among the vanguard, with an eye on the construction of a Marxist-Leninist referent. Secondly, to achieve its fusion with the broad masses of the class in the form of a true communist party, crystallization of the objective relationship between vanguard theory and the proletarian movement, whose social effects are revolution underway through people's war. 4. Does the work of reconstituting communism fulfill any task with the current Spanish communist movement? If the ideological reconstitution that we are working to carry out points towards the universal, towards the general lines of the revolution in the present historical moment, this is proof that the communist movement in the Spanish state, as a concrete materialization of the international communist movement, cannot be alien to the situation that the latter is going through as a result of the end of the cycle, hegemonized by revisionism, in the form of organizations and trends which are incapable of solving the challenges that the World Proletarian Revolution, WPR, has ahead of in the present historic moment. Faced with this, and the fight against all the revisionist rottenness that keeps communism in the quagmire of an increasingly decadent opportunism, represented in the lead by the syndicalist parliamentarian line headed by the Kappa Kappa Epsilon and its disputed patriotic minions, the movement for reconstitution raises frank and determined two-line struggle to relocate Marxism-Leninism in its vanguard position, and to politically end all those abetted agents of the bourgeoisie that continue to channel the faith of their diminishing masses towards the reform of the bourgeois state. 5. How does this reconstitution influence the reconstruction of a communist party of a new type? Faced with those who propose the reconstruction of the Communist Party that materializes in the well-known and failed calls for organizational unity without defined principles among vanguard sectors, the line of reconstitution has always postulated the need to reconstitute the Communist Party of re-merging revolutionary theory with the labor movement as the very content of the acting revolution. Far from being complementary approaches or nuances in any way, what is elucidated here is the course of two antagonistic conceptions around the nature of the Communist Party. We are aware that only from the ideological reconstitution and the two-line struggle around the summation, as the engine that it is for the ideological development of the vanguard, can a truly revolutionary unity not only be proclaimed but really conquered, built on an ideological base that, then, will allow the fusion with the masses of the class to be undertaken, generating that system of relations that we call the Communist Party. To do this, the first thing is to recognize that there is no such communist party in the Spanish state today, since what we have is a host of organizations that bring sectors of the vanguard together with hardly any relationship with the great masses of the class and attached to outdated postulates that liquidate all revolutionary possibility. 6. What communist parties have been the motivators of this political line? The line of reconstitution is inspired, as it could not be otherwise for a communist, by the revolutionary experiences that placed the proletariat at the vanguard of humanity. It is not, however, trying to repeat a petrified scheme of a specific episode, but to extract the lessons inherited, the ideological spirit that guided its practical letter, to apply them in the present. The milestones of the revolutionary proletariat during the October cycle, which not only include the great victories for the revolution, but also the defeats that express the progressive wear of the cycle's premises, since it is not possible, as revisionism does, to understand the former without the latter, since they are all expressions of the same process of the world proletarian revolution. 7. There is a committee for reconstitution. What function does it have? To this day, the Committee for Reconstitution is the public manifestation and publishing body of Línea Proletaria. It is the fruit of the unity achieved, through two-line struggle, by the different vanguard detachments that until not long ago constituted the fragmented political materialization of the line of Reconstitution. 8. What is your opinion about trade unionism in Spain? In the first place, it goes without saying that a communist will always understand the various expressions of resistance on the part of those masses with no other aspirational reference than their adaptation to an undisputed medium, as legitimate. However, it should be kept in mind, from a deeper and less immediate perspective, that trade unionism has already passed its historically progressive stage by contributing to the formation of the proletariat as an economic class, laying the objective foundations for its maturation as a political class. With imperialism, as Lenin elaborated well, unionism loses that historical innocence and becomes a transmission belt for the bourgeoisie in the labor movement. The proletariat has already developed its superior form of organization, the Communist Party, and the forms typical of its stage of conformation as a class in itself, such as the trade union, do nothing today but reproduce it to variable capital, in frank complicity with the reform of the bourgeois state, with the reproduction of capitalist relations, and at the service of one of the main byproducts of the imperialist phase of capitalism, the labor aristocracy, a bourgeois segment of the proletarian class that, benefiting from the international division of labor, makes use of those old forms that are the trade union and the liberal labor party, social democrat, to obtain their share of representation in the inter-bourgeois agreement. 9. And about feminism? In relation to the previous question, we must reject any way of corporativization that binds the masses to that faith in the reform of the bourgeois state, as the bourgeois women's movement, or feminism, has done increasingly explicitly. Feminism, which poses a conflict between the sexes as a way to redistribute shares of participation and power in the public and private spheres of capitalist relations, does not call into question the fundamental basis of class society, in which the origin and foundation of all oppression of women is found, which has always led it to oppose, in this imperialist phase of revolution or barbarism, the revolutionary experiences of the proletariat. Communism considers the emancipation of women as part of the necessary intrinsic content of the proletarian revolution, as a work of self-emancipation of the oppressed. For the line of Reconstitution, therefore, only through the proletarian revolution can the root of the issue be reached, the family, private property, and the social division of labor, the foundation of any society divided into oppressors and oppressed. 10. Could the situation that is taking place in Catalonia be described as a struggle for national liberation? The existence of a strong national movement in Catalonia is undeniable, and its masses demonstrated in the streets their desire for their right to self-determination to be exercised with executive effect, inflicting a political defeat on the Spanish state when on October 1, 2017 they demonstrated that they were capable organizing with the intention of exercising that right. However, this insurrectionary, mass and executive aspect, with a valuable load of political experience regarding the exercise of the democratic mandate and contempt for bourgeois legality, has proven incapable of imposing itself on the other aspect, also bourgeois, which is that of parliamentary representativeness, since the former is, like the latter, anchored to the behavior of a class that has already lost all revolutionary vigor, once its historical project has been consummated and decadent. Demonstrating not only the cretinism of nationalism draped in red, a petite bourgeoisie that offers its national bourgeoisie an invaluable job of containment of the masses, but also the very inevitability of such a course, since it was an insurrectionary logic without a revolutionary actor on the terrain that could convey it in another way, against which it can only end up, mediated by politicking and the settling of bourgeois scores, reinforcing the reformed reproduction of the bourgeois state. 11. What do you think about the general and regional elections in Spain? The elections do not express more than the redistribution of the quotas of political power of the different bourgeois fractions in their parliamentary arena, and the only interest that currently has for the vanguard is as an expression of the state of the links between the bourgeois state and the masses. Every current call for the participation of the proletariat in the electoral circus expresses the need of the aspiring representatives of the labor aristocracy and petty bourgeoisie to win over the proletarian votes in order to continue exercising their cretinism, despite themselves, increasingly extra-parliamentary. This is given that all revisionism is, or would be delighted to be able to mobilize all those votes that usually swell the percentages of abstention in order to demonstrate that another form of management of capitalism, of the exploitation of the proletariat, is possible, and thus further reinforce its role of liquidators of all possibility of revolutionary maturation of the consciousness of the proletarians. Faced with this, the line of Reconstitution is clear that trying to accumulate masses through parliamentarism, that is, through propaganda and not through the program and the new power, does not mean anything else than the reinforcement, with a communist patina, of one of the clearer and most transparent expressions of the masses-state dialectic, that of political representativeness, latched in periodic and democratic readjustment of the spontaneous demands of all social sectors within the mechanisms of corporatization of the bourgeois state. Therefore, there is no room for parliamentary participation once the political reconstitution has been completed, since the only revolutionary means of incorporating the masses into the revolution is through the generation, application, and experience of their own power, of their own dictatorship, that is, through the people's war that begins once the Communist Party is reconstituted. It is in the pre-party stage of ongoing political reconstitution when the vanguard can consider making use of parliamentary and institutional means in general, solely as a means of propaganda among the advanced sectors, that is, as a means of accumulating vanguard forces, and bearing in mind, furthermore, that this legal and peaceful path will in no way be the main instrument for the deployment of its mass line, nor will it be applicable at any juncture or for any purpose other than the plan of reconstitution. Thus, finding ourselves today in a still initial phase of said plan, that of ideological reconstitution, and being that fundamental questions that will support its grouping around its Marxist-Leninist referent remain unresolved among the theoretical vanguard, like the general and political line of the revolution, the only consistent attitude towards the bourgeois elections at this moment, far from the weak and sterile active abstention, is the call for a boycott, as an expression of rejection of the ties that the cretinism tries to impose on the proletariat, as a means of educating the masses of the class in contempt for the legal instruments of the bourgeoisie and in the need for revolutionary violence, and as a call for the vanguard to deal with the necessary tasks in the present moment. 12. This year is the year of the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution of 1917. What do you think about this anniversary? The best tribute to which this 100th anniversary summoned us was the development and deepening of the summation of the cycle which opened with that revolution, as is shown in issue number 2 of Línea Proletaria, which is a good example of how, through the application of Marxism to Marxism, we can develop it and put it back in its position as an ideological and political referent. Nothing in common, then, with the vacuous and folkloric mentions for revisionism, filled with both dogmatism and superficiality. The October Revolution entails the first experience of dictatorship of the proletariat, with the glorious but ephemeral exception of the Parisian Commune, a source of fundamental learning for our class that would not have been possible if Bolshevism had not imposed itself on all those who bet on to keep the proletariat dependent on the initiative of other classes, fearful that it would dare to apply its own will to be a revolutionary class by force of arms. October demonstrated that the proletariat needs to equip itself with its highest form of organization, the Communist Party. It also demonstrated that the proletariat, as Marx had already seen after the Commune's experience, far from taking the bourgeois state machinery intact, has to build its new power from the destruction of its bourgeois antagonist. Likewise, the summation allows us to understand to what extent the cycle which opened in 1917 is framed within the historical intertwining of the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, which would necessarily leave its mark on the content of the revolutionary program of the proletariat, as well as the limit that, as negation of what was historically contributed by the bourgeoisie, was imposed by having no other reference than the same bourgeois work. It was necessary to take up arms, definitely, and by doing so, not only was the greatest revolutionary transformation that humanity had ever seen achieved, but with it an entire revolutionary cycle was opened that turned the world upside down, demonstrating that communism, far from being a mere analytical interpretation of the world, is mainly the means to transform it and build on it a new emancipated humanity. 13. It is also the 50th anniversary of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, GPCR. Why do you uphold this socialist revolution? What has this revolution contributed to the international communist movement? The proletarian revolution cannot be understood today without the elements that the revolutionary experience of the Chinese proletariat contributed to the historical heritage of the revolutionary subject, to the People's War as the proletarian military line against the old insurrectionary coup, to the two-line struggle as the development of the class struggle in theory, as the revolutionary critique of revisionism on the ideological level. The Cultural Revolution is added as a form to broaden and develop the all-encompassing dictatorship of the proletariat in all social relations, fighting the new revisionism engendered by the ongoing revolution itself and established in the state and party apparatus. Opposite to the old theory of the productive forces, which subordinated the subjective factor and the transformation of all social relations to the objectivism of economic development, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution is the demonstration that class struggle continues during socialism, that this subjective factor, revolutionary consciousness, is the main factor in socialism, the radical transformation of society from capitalism to communism. This, which must be an axiom of the revolution for every Marxist-Leninist today, is something that the Chinese revolutionaries learned through the critical analysis of the experience of their Soviet comrades and through their own experience, especially after the Great Leap Forward, which exemplifies and reinforces the importance of the summation of the universal experience of the revolutionary proletariat for the development of the revolutionary movement. A lesson that could not but take place within a framework of paradigmatic limitations, which endowed the necessary contradictory character to the theoretical practical expression of said lesson, still inserted in a dominant mass-estate dialectic that obstructed and ended up drowning out the sparkles of the new, of that vanguard party dialectic that prefigured the way to continue developing revolution from the highest levels of the cycle. These concepts, which seem fundamental to us, emerge precisely from study, from the perspective of the summation, of the experience of the GPCR and, rightly, point to it as the highest point reached by the revolutionary proletariat during the October cycle in its effort to build the New World. To delve into these issues, we recommend the central article of issue number 0 of Línea Proletaria. This is a work that, in all humility and to the best of our knowledge, we believe draws lessons from the GPCR's experience which depth and implications even the best Maoists have not fully realized. 14. Regarding internationalism, do you think that there are currently socialist countries or not? No, we believe that there are no countries that can be considered socialist, to the extent that those that claim to be such are not, as practice stubbornly demonstrates, support bases of any world proletarian revolution, but rather support bases of one or another imperialist bloc in conflict, governed by bureaucratic bourgeoisies erected to the beat of the revisionist hegemony within the international communist movement. At present we live in a moment of interregnum between two cycles of the world proletarian revolution, which means not only the episodic failure of one or another concrete revolutionary process, but also the loss of the fundamental international reference that made all these concrete processes part of that same world revolution. If ideologically that international reference is expressed as the general line of the revolution, politically it does so as the Communist International, And we have the synthetic historical example of this in the 21 conditions of the Comintern, giving a global character to the wedge opened in Soviet October, around which the communist parties were formed. This historical moment of interregnum implies, therefore, the absence of such elements. There can be no general line without the ideological reconstruction of communism, which will provide the world proletariat with a universal vanguard theory to be applied through the specific analysis of each field of action, in the form of the political line. Likewise, there can be no international without a political reconstitution of communism, without a communist party developing a revolution and synthesizing said general line for the promotion of more support bases of the WPR. We must be clear that this work is the responsibility of the revolutionary proletariat, so it cannot be expected that today hegemonic revisionism will reconstitute the international, the heirs of the dissolution of the Comintern, of the capitalist restoration in the USSR and the PRC, of the liquidation, in short, of the proletarian revolution. 15. What do you think of the Naxal insurgency in India? Does the CPI, Maoist, fulfill a role of proletarian vanguard? And what about the Communist Party of the Philippines? The line of reconstitution has expressed on various occasions its unequivocal solidarity and admiration for the struggle of the revolutionaries in India, and its commitment to contribute, also through revolutionary criticism at the present time, so that its development proceeds along the most fruitful paths for the world revolution, against those who establish a solidarity based on tailism or, even worse, on the reinforcement of the liquidationist tendencies that made their way into international Maoism as a result of the capitulation of the People's War in Nepal. We cannot ignore that this need for ideological reconstitution also includes the most advanced trend within the October cycle, Maoism, which, in its peak moments, did not know how to promote a revolutionary platform that would point towards a new international based on the support of the mass armed processes that were taking place in areas such as India and the Philippines, where Maoism has been able to mount ongoing peasant rebellions. The bankruptcy of the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, RIM, demonstrated the paralysis of the Maoist left, which was unable to form an anti-revisionist front for the two-line struggle against the opportunism that was making its way within the RIM itself, which had grown with the Nepali disaster. If the line of reconstitution takes the example of Nepal, as demonstrated by its work in this regard, very seriously, it is because this experience reveals elements that must be subjected to critical analysis in this period of ideological reconstitution that we are going through, and that directly affect the Maoist camp. We have been able to verify in recent years, with the exception of the line of reconstitution and some detachments of the Maoist left, how solidarity with the Indian comrades is hegemonized by that right-wing and centrist opportunism that greeted the Prakandist liquidation, something that threatens to reinforce the most right-wing tendencies within the CPI, Maoist. If in the Indian case this is a reasonable concern, given the general state of the ICM, in the Philippine case it is justified with increasing clarity, since the itinerary followed by Sison's PKP dangerously points to a management of the capacity for mass mobilization, including armed mobilization, as a negotiating weapon on the table of its talks with the state, which, more than a people's war, points toward a military line typical of armed reformist guerrillas. All in all, despite the fact that we consider that the closing of the October cycle, as aware of a historical paradigm that structured its entire development, is a challenge that affects and pertains to all the traditions or historical tendencies of the communist movement, this does not mean that each context should not be taken into account when dealing with it. The need for the summation of the October cycle is not incompatible with the various concrete scenarios that exist today in the ICM and the situation in these countries, in which the Maoist revolutionaries have meritoriously managed to keep a movement of armed masses standing under the hammer and sickle, presents an invaluable setting for that general challenge facing communism today. Our call is for these parties, which are the result of a link between the vanguard and the masses which does not exist in any other place, to take advantage of their ability to push the vanguard in that direction, both internally, reinforcing the revolutionary process of which they are protagonists, as well as facing the rest of the ICM. 16. Going back to the issue of the peculiar GPCR, what objectives do you think this socialist revolution had in China and internationally with the oppressed peoples? The prominence that Lenin foreshadowed for the role of the Asian peoples in the 20th century is well known. That wind from the east that would gradually shift the center of gravity of the world proletarian revolution. That is because that the intertwining of the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, a characteristic that marks the entire cycle, was shown markedly in these countries. Given the degree of entrenchment and survival of semi-feudal and semi-colonial conditions that placed the Chinese communists in the position to test their strategic creativity, extracting as much juice as possible from the Soviet experience, and many times despite the guidelines of the International, very much marked by the conditions and perspectives of the revolution in Europe. The Chinese revolutionaries, through the New Democracy Revolution, will link the pending historical tasks of bourgeois content with the proletarian revolution itself, with the construction of socialism. Likewise, they will know how to transform the peasant revolt, as well as the insurrectional temptation of the young Chinese proletariat, into a people's war, developing the military line of the revolutionary proletariat. In this way, we see how the Leninist line developed in the USSR based on the alliance of the revolutionary proletariat and the peasantry is broadened, as Lenin himself announced and Mao deepened, with the international alliance of the revolutionary proletariat and the oppressed peoples where conditions analogous to the Chinese scenario exist, in which the revolutionary proletariat has to link the ongoing elements of the national anti-imperialist revolution and the peasant war to the construction of socialism. Naturally, as the opposite end of the doctrinaire that, sticking to the classist letter, not the spirit, remained blind to these intertwining elements that the proletariat had to integrate in a revolutionary way in its work, the other side of the coin was also generated, exacerbating these contradictions that were to be integrated and overcome and positively reaffirming them instead as the third worldist condition of the revolution, which is the case of the three worlds theory, the impossibility of people's war in the imperialist countries, etc. 17. In this revolution, were the mistakes of Mao Zedong and the CCP during the Chinese Revolution revealed with their respective self-criticism? It is not until a critical summation of all experience is carried out that the vanguard can extract its limitations and lessons. That is why, we believe, it is not acceptable to attribute the limitations of this or that process to mere particular errors, to failures in the thinking of one or more people. Put simply, neither the fate of the Soviet experience is due to the mistakes of Lenin or Stalin, nor that of the Chinese one to the mistakes of Mao. The question, therefore, is more complex, and these easy paths end up leading to the substitution of criticism for demagogy. We have the example of the Peruvian revolutionaries, who will be the ones who, even within the October cycle and as the final point of the journey of that east wind, will bring the elements contributed by the entire Chinese revolutionary experience to their maximum expression. Things, like the peasant war, that the Chinese revolutionaries had to ride, as a way of integrating into the revolutionary plan that which is already given in a social reality, and which contributed to generating in them an overvaluation of the spontaneous element, a confidence in the permanent or latent state of rebellion in the masses, were created by the Peruvian revolutionaries from their conscious action, that is, from their planned anticipation, the way in which the learning and internalization of the laws of the revolution is historically expressed. In this way, not only the armed peasant masses, but also the very instruments of the revolution, army, party, and new power are generated from ideology, thereby expanding the importance of the subjective factor in the revolutionary work. Matters like this can be studied in all their perspective in the aforementioned central article of issue number 0 of Línea Proletaria. 18. You have published an article about Ireland. On a personal level, I am very interested in the Irish question. Why was this article published and what is it about? The analysis of the national question, in general, is framed in the context of ideological reconstitution in which we are. If one of the main elements that we are extracting from this summation exercise has to do with the historical intertwining of the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, this text is a particular example of how this unfolds its consequences in various and related aspects of the communist movement, being in this case, the national question and the proletarian military line. On numerous and notable occasions throughout history, the national question, and the Irish case as a concretion of it, has been an issue that has made it possible to draw the dividing line between revolution and opportunism within the labor and communist movement. It happened in the time of Marx, when he pointed out the need for the British labor movement to become aware of the national oppression that English imperialism exerted on Ireland, as well as in Lenin's polemics, when the firm defense of the right to self-determination rose as an imperative of a consistent internationalism, in the face of the bourgeoisification of the national labor movement, which prioritized imperialist complicity with its bourgeoisie over its class ties with the world. Proletariat. 19. Are there groups or parties that fight for the reconstitution of communism? The movement for reconstitution, naturally. The reconstitution of communism is not, unfortunately for some, a slogan, an abstract idea, or fresh garment with which to dress the old miseries, but rather consists of a plan of action that sets and allows the development of ideological, political, and organizational factors through which such a process has to materialize. For this reason, we encourage all those communists concerned about the reconstitution of communism as a revolutionary referent to remain attentive to the developments, at all levels, of the movement for reconstitution and to not give up their efforts for the critical apprehension of the revolutionary worldview of the proletariat. 20. What is the Revolutionary Communist Party? Is it Bob Avakian's party? They are two different organizations. The Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States was, decades ago, a detachment at the vanguard of the international communist movement, promoting the ideological struggle through a critical effort that deserves due attention. See, as an example, the document of their authorship that was digitalized by Línea Proletaria Editions in 2016. However, to this day, it is an example of the bankruptcy of a Maoism that, unable to sustain itself on the pillars of Marxism-Leninism to face its historical scores, such as the summation of the GPCR, resorts to the exacerbation of the worst and most expensive traits that paved the way for the triumph of revisionism, such as that scientism of messianic rhetoric and the big cult of personality that it exhales in an increasingly grotesque way. For its part, the Revolutionary Communist Party of the Spanish state was born in the early 1990s, at a time when, with the collapse of the Soviet social imperialist bloc, the world crisis of communism acquired even greater significance. In this context, the comrades of the RCP endow themselves with a plan for the reconstitution of the Communist Party, from which they begin a journey that supposes the creation and development of what is known as the line of reconstitution, with two fundamental milestones, of a concretion and development of the plan in the form of the thesis of reconstitution of the Communist Party in 1996, to a self-critical summation of said practical experience, the new orientation on the path of the Reconstitution of the Communist Party, published in 2005, without which the course, progress, and growth of the line of reconstitution since then cannot be understood, being a living and uninterrupted tradition in which the movement for reconstitution is proudly inscribed. Committee for Reconstitution, Spanish State, October 2019.